Thanks a lot for that introduction here. Um, yeah. Yes, so here has already mentioned my blog, which I'll advertise at the start of this talk, Microscopes and Monsters. And I've been doing this for about 12 years now, and it's partly as a way of sort of writing in a sort of more traditional natural history style about the microscopic world. So a lot of what I'm talking about today has appeared at some point on this blog. Um, there's a paper I wrote back in 2012, so over a decade ago, which sort of summarizes some of the ideas I'll be covering. I've just looked on Google Scholar, and I think you're going to struggle to get hold of a copy of this. So I might have to sort of dig out a PDF and send it to you to put on the Web Academy website, maybe. But where I want to start was a paper I read when it came out in 1987 by um, Geoffrey Fryer, who was a zoologist, fish biologist, and microcrustacean expert. And at the end of his career, just before he retired, he wrote a sort of provocative review arguing that ecology was getting too quantitative and we needed to sort of re-establish the traditional sort of qualitative skills of just looking and observing. He wasn't he wasn't against quantitative biology. He just thought that the pendulum had swung too far away from recognizing the importance of observational biology. So these subjects have been on my mind for some time, and then about 2011, so about the same time as I was writing my paper Semiotics of Slime, Nigel Wilby, who's a macrophyte biologist in the UK who I'd worked with, he wrote an editorial in Aquatic Conservation on the need to back up all of our metrics we use for ecological assessment with some sort of explanation that's accessible to the general public, what he called a guiding image. And obviously, with him being a macrophyte biologist and interested in lakes, his mind went to the water lily paintings by Monet. It's quite a provocative read, just a couple of pages long. So again, I'd sort of strongly recommend you have a look for that. And I'll come back to Nigel's essay right at the end of this. So I've divided my talk into three parts, and I've illustrated each of them with a science-themed painting, starting off with this famous Rembrandt image. So my career has mostly been responding to the needs of the regulatory organisations in the UK, but also in other parts of Europe, and in particular to two pieces of legislation. We don't need to go into the details today: Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, and then from 2000 onwards, the Water Framework Directive. The result of this, as Hera said, was a metric, which diatoms for assessing river and lake ecological quality. It's pronounced Dalek, and there's a team of us involved with this. Steve Juggins was doing the quantitative part. There's a few representatives of regulatory organisations on that list as well. That became the standard UK method for assessing periphyton, or what referred to as phytobenthos in the Water Framework Directive. And Steve's written a nice little Dalek app, a nice little shiny app that lets you do the calculations. So that's the sort of the bread and butter of my professional life, as it were. We put together this metric to respond to a specific need. And then once we'd done that, process didn't end. For the past or best part of 20 years, we've been reflecting and revising on the metrics. And as Hera mentioned in the introduction, we've also sort of developed a variant for metabarcoding as well. But then the other part of my life as a consultant has been dissemination. And really, there's two important constituencies. First of all, I did a lot of training with the biologists who were going to use the method. So the system we've got in the UK is that our regulatory biologists tend to be multidisciplinary. They look at invertebrates, macrophytes, and now when the TDI came along, they started to look at diatoms as well. the net result is they've got a holistic understanding of the systems they're studying, even if they're not the sort of the most advanced diatomists you could find. So I needed to train them, who they often didn't have much of a background. And then there's also this big issue, which I'll come to in a moment, of how we communicate the findings from our diatom work to the not just to the regulators, but to the people that they're going to be regulating, and to the wider public who are going to have to pay for it. One of the things that comes up in the training was that we could certainly see some trends in our data that we could relate to changing patterns of nutrient inputs. This is my local river, the River Wear. And we can see, as you go downstream, levels of the TDI go up, reflecting ecological change caused by increased phosphorus. And this was part of an evidence base to install phosphorus stripping at 7 works along the river at a cost of about £7 million. But what you can also see in that graph is quite a lot of within site variation as you go down the river. It's not, we're not getting exactly the same number every time we go back there. This is 3 or 4 years data, a couple of samples each year. We've got variation, and I needed to explain to the people I was training why we had that variation. And because, as Hera said in the introduction, I've also got an art degree. I was doing the art degree at the time. I started to use illustrations as part of the training sessions to sort of explain why diatom samples we collected were varying in different parts of the river, depending on the amount of shear stress, for example, depending on the amount of filamentous algae, and so on and so forth. And then explaining that in terms of the types of diatoms that might be favoured under particular situations. So it was a sort of fairly natural step for me to sort of pick up a pencil and a paintbrush and just produce some illustrations that I could scan in to help with my training talks. But then we also wanted to indicate that time is one of the variables we have to think about. And in a river, it would be the time since there'd been a major disturbance event. And I turned to some work that my friend Lydia King did as part of her PhD in Wasswater in the English Lake District. That's me in the lake, not her at this point. You'll see a picture of her in a moment. So she did some artificial substrate experiments watching colonization by diatoms and other algae. She had some SEMs as part of her thesis, and I was able to turn those into a sequence of illustrations that just showed, look, we get different diatoms depending on the time since the most recent disturbance. And that was the colonization phase. And then after 6 weeks in the lake, we had a much richer, higher biofilm with cymbellas, and those are sort of profile views, girdle views of sort of Gomphonemia or acuminatum tends to be pretty common here, and a lot of acnanthidium in this particular system. Not much in this particular lake at that particular time of green algae or cyanobacteria. But I'm just giving you an idea of the sort of the roots, I suppose, of my interest in illustrating sort of periphyton and diatoms. And then we could relate that to the conceptual habitat matrix that Barry Biggs, Jan Stevenson, and Rex Lowe put together, their sort of classic paper from 1998, which again, I hope you've all read, sort of strongly encourage you to look at it if you haven't. And sort of trying to say that all of these factors, the spatial and temporal matter factors, all interacting to explain why we weren't getting identical results every time we went out in the field, and why we had to build that uncertainty into the advice we were given. On a slightly different strand, we used the illustrations to sort of visualize, try and explain what good moderate status actually meant. So the important in the Water Framework Directive is to differentiate between good status, where you're slight change from what you expect, and moderate status, where there's a more substantial change. And this is the graph is the hard data that Steve generated from all the data we collected when we were developing dialect. EQR is the ecological quality ratio, observed over expected. So a value of 1 means that you've pretty much got what you were expecting. And the open circles were the sensitive species and nutrient sensitive species that tend to decline as nutrients increase, and the closed circles are the tolerant ones, which are increasing as nutrient concentrations increase, and sort of the EQR gradually decreasing. And we were looking for a rationale of where to place a good moderate boundary, which is the key regulatory boundary. And we thought that the point where they cross over would make a good point that we could explain certainly to our scientifically minded regulators. But then when I thought about it, that was also the point where the sorts of communities that we are finding in our low nutrient rivers and lakes. I'm not suggesting you get the same communities in rivers and lakes. It's just happened to be a useful illustration for this particular situation, where the sort of the Acnanthidium dominated communities, tabularias, gomphonemas, that we were finding in good conditions started to be replaced by different structures of community, fundamentally different structures, where we had more filamentous algae, we had organisms like Reuchosphenia piggybacking on the filamentous algae, and we had many more motile diatoms sort of moving through the interspecies between the particulate matter and the filamentous algae. So there's a sort of a shift in the nature of the community. As a scientist, we put that in quantitative terms, but there's also a qualitative aspect that is useful to remind yourself about. So again, we wrote a paper, myself, Lydia, and Bernie Nikam from Ireland. It's in the Transactions of the Royal Irish Academy, if you can find that online. Trying to explain in sort of visual terms what we thought good status looked like for diatoms and other algae. I think it's important to stress that the sort of work I'm doing now, you can't consider diatoms in isolation. You've got to think of them as being part of a community. So let's move on, explaining this to the skeptical world. I say skeptical world because the work we did contributed to a general pattern of assessments all over the country, dividing all the rivers into one of 5 status classes. High and good, that's a tick, that's fine. If it's below good status, moderate, poor, or bad, then the remedial work is required, better sewage work, sort of less runoff, whatever, in order to restore it to good status. And when the first national map came out, we got a pattern. I think only about 14% of our rivers were in good status, and diatoms were one of the most important reasons for this failure to achieve good status. Fish was the other one. That was largely because of their difficulties in migration. But diatoms are one of the main reasons for failure. So there's a lot hanging on our shoulder, because if we're going to get these rivers back to good status, it meant there had to be a rise in the water bills, the utility bills people were paying, sort of figure of £46. And this, don't forget, is 20 years ago. So that'd be quite a larger sum now. So people are saying, why am I having to have an increase in my utility bill of £46? What am I going to get out of it? And sort of transparency is an integral part of the Water Framework Directive. And so we had to explain what was going on. And I just put this up. We'll come back to the River Wylie in a little while, but it happened, this sort of a conversation that happened around this time when we were doing a study on the River Wylie with the local utility company involved, and we were noticing elevated concentrations of soluble reactive phosphorus downstream of 2 sewage works. There's also contributions from storm sewers and agricultural runoff. But the conversation that I want to report here isn't so much about the results per se. We had nutrient concentrations that suggested enrichment, and we had a diatom community that suggested enrichment. But somebody from the utility company, in just a coffee time conversation, she said, "I'm not disagreeing with what you are telling us, but we need to justify the price rises that would result from improved effluent treatment, and the public don't know what diatoms are." That was a sort of a challenge in a way to sort of try and spread the word, I guess, try and sort of help people to understand why their water rates, their utility bills were going up, and what they were going to get for it. And a few years later, I put the same thing into a cartoon. I actually had a cartoon published in the Science of the Total Environment. Um, what do we get for our €500,000 investment in better effluent treatment? Different shaped diatoms. It's not much of an answer, really, is it? We really need a sort of better sort of justification for what diatoms are actually doing in our ecosystem. Not just diatoms, because they're really just sort of proxies for wider shifts in the microbial communities. And the point we must hang on to is that we take several steps away from reality in the process of producing the data that we hand on to the utility companies and the regulators in order to make the decisions and justify the investments. So this is a slightly blurry photograph of the bed of my local river, the River Wear again, showing sort of some growths of filamentous algae. So that's what a river user might see, what a fisherman might see if he stood in the middle of the river. Put it under the microscope, we see that filamentous green algae is actually Eulothrix zonata. We see quite a rich assemblage of diatoms at this particular point in the river. But then, no, the diatomists are going to go yet another step. They're going to drop that sample into digesting a digestion mixture, take away all of the organic matter, so they're left just with the diatoms. And then they're going to process that data yet further, so that in the end, we get a sort of fairly abstract expression of what the water users are actually seeing. So this is the point where I'm going to bring in another character. And if you've never heard of him, don't worry. It's called Henry de la Beche. He was an important geologist from the early part of the 19th century. If you know the American novelist Tracy Chevalier, she wrote Girl with a Pearl Earring, but she's written a number of other books, mostly with a historical and a visual arts slant. And she wrote a book about the paleontologist Mary Annin, and Henry de la Beche has a walk-on part in this book. Henry de la Beche in 1830, it was just after the Napoleonic Wars, there was a recession on, and Mary Annin was in dire straits because people weren't buying the fossils she was collecting. So in order to raise money for her, he painted a picture, and from that picture he produced a number of engravings, and those engravings sold in great numbers, and some of the proceeds went to help the Annin family. And what he painted was the first ever depiction of dinosaurs as living organisms. So there was an awareness, a growing awareness that there were these fossils of skeletons of organisms that no longer existed. But until Henry de la Beche put this drawing together, nobody had attempted to sort of reconstruct what those organisms might have looked like. And actually, if you ever visit Ingrid Jutner at the National Museum of Wales, this picture is in the National Museum of Wales. It's not on display, but if you ask, you can go and see it, and they'll give you a pair of white gloves. And you can look at what is, if you think about how widespread sort of dinosaur reconstructions are now, you see it's quite a pivotal moment. Henry de la Beche, he sort of puts, we've got some plesiosaurs, pterodactyls, ichthyosaurs. We can see this poor dinosaur here that's about to be gobbled up. It's even got some coprolites in it. This is quite shocking in the early part of the 19th century. There's a few points we can quibble with. Henry de la Beche's family had some plantations in the West Indies, and so he put some palm trees in the backdrop of this, even though palm trees didn't evolve until sometime after the Jurassic. But what we can see here is a certain amount of hard evidence. a certain amount of contemporary understanding of ecological relationships, sort of some sense of which all, what an organism needed to be a hunter and what an organism um, needed to be to get away from a hunter, for example. There's a hefty dose of informed speculation that went into this image as well, and the result was the in 1830 this watercolor painting Duria Antiquia. So he starts with dead bones, or perhaps to put it in diatom language, empty fustules, and we end up with some sort of sense of the living organisms. And this had a big impact. Within 5 or 10 years, other people were producing similar sorts of illustrations. There were even sort of the first sculptures of living dinosaurs, the ones that you now see in Crystal Palace in South London, date from about this time. But I think it helped scientists to start thinking about dinosaurs as real organisms. I guess before this point, the paleontologists were part of the Age of Enlightenment. They were quite happy sort of classifying, differentiating the different organisms together. And now we're into the Romantic era, and people are thinking more in terms of processes. And by thinking of dinosaurs as real organisms, you have some sort of thought experiments that you could then try and test in different ways. But also, it helped to capture the public imagination. It made environmental change respectable, and it sort of contributed to the environment in which Darwin could flourish. And so I sort of took some of these ideas away, went back to some of the drawings I was using for training courses, and tried to bring them to life. So here are the water diagrams based on Lydia's data. So actually, sort of the density is about right in this, as well as sort of the organisms. That's sort of the pioneer stage. That's after 2 or 3 weeks, and then that was after 6 weeks again. Just to give a sense of what was under people's noses, but perhaps they weren't necessarily noticing. And so just a couple of quotes at this point, first from the late Stephen J. Gould, reminding us that scientific illustrations are not frills or summaries, they are foci for modes of thought. And sort of Leonardo da Vinci sort of emphasizing the important role that metaphor plays in our armory as scientists. So I saw this as a potential tool for raising awareness, demonstrating that algae are integral components of river and lake ecosystems. They link the unknown to the known. And we can draw analogies and set up metaphors of terrestrial ecosystems, but never forgetting that we don't really know what it's like to be crawling through a biofilm. There's still a healthy amount of guesswork. Here's one of the programs. I mean, the title "Walking with Dinosaurs." It was a BBC program, sort of a natural history documentary program, using this kind of reconstruction from about 15 years ago. And I just noticed there's a new dinosaur program on Netflix, narrated by Morgan Freeman, just released last week, I think. So, these dinosaur reconstructions are everywhere, and we forget where they came from. And I think there's sort of lessons we can learn going forward, because we're explaining what people can't see in terms of what they can. So this is a sort of quite common sight in the summer, to pick up a stone from a fairly good quality river. Hasn't got much of a biofilm on it, has got sort of quite a few caddisflies. And then we start to visualize that biofilm in terms that people do understand. The picture actually shows a mayfly mouth parts, and it was a sort of a thought experiment of my own, just to sort of think about selective grazing, and you think that the relationship between a diatom and a mayfly nymph, is about the same as us and a pea, or a cow and a piece of grass, or something like that. So, but the main point is we're putting it in terms that sort of link the microscopic world to a language that hopefully the customers, the utility, the people paying the bills to the utility companies can start to understand a bit better. Then the third part of my talk, how am I doing for time? Oh, better speed up a bit. Is actually how scientists could use these as thought experiments. I've got this picture here. It's one of the few depictions we think of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope, who was a friend of Vermeer. So there's another link with Tracy Chevalier, because he walks onto the girl with the pearl earring pages several times. So back to the River Wyly, chalk stream in southern England. That's what the diatomist sees. I visited it 6 times over the course of a year. It's really quite variable, but the main point, quite not an unusual pattern, that we've got a sort of few diatoms tend to be very abundant and a long tail of less common ones. What the diatomist might not see is at the top of this stone that they came from, the site, there's quite a lot of, there are mats of blue-green algae. I think we've got some Batrachospermum or something there as well. And actually, we could take that diagram of the relative abundance of diatoms and re-express it in terms of the relative abundance of everything, and find this is basically a cyanobacterial mat, and the diatoms are playing a relatively small part in the functioning of the system as a whole. Second example, Round Loch of Glen Head. So we've moved to Scotland, southwest Scotland, a location where Rick Batterby and his colleagues did some important work on the role of acid rain in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Having used this as one of their test cases for proof of acidification being linked to air pollution, they then went on monitoring it for 20 years or so afterwards. And I had a conversation with Roger Flower about, there was a definite recovery notice, but one of the things that Roger pointed out was there's a lot more navicular leptostriata, not just compared to the acidified period, but also to the pre-acidified period. And we couldn't quite sort of come up with an explanation for this. I made a visit to Round Loch of Glen Head, and there's a sort of a lot of this sort of slimy brown gunk surrounding the macrophytes and on top of the stones. Roger says that was never there in the past when they were first visiting it in the 80s, when acid rain was at its peak. We didn't find this slimy gunk. When we put it under the microscope, there's a lot of Mugiotia, the green alga Mugiotia. There's a very thin formidium, quite a few other types of diatom in there as well. And having that sort of contextual information, you could see the Mugiotia and the Cyanobacteria were creating a sort of a matrix. And within that matrix, the navicular leptostriata is able to move around. I always think of navicular leptostriata as being like a climber moving up a sort of a narrow chimney. It's using its 2 race to move in 3 dimensions, one attached, then the other, as it pulls itself up and around. But it needs a sort of a 3-dimensionality in order to thrive. And that's what we found in Round Loch of Glen Head, and what wasn't there as far as we know in the past. The thinking is that the sulfur dioxide levels had dropped a lot, but the nitrous oxide levels hadn't. And it might have been the boost of nitrogen was one of the things that contributed to the success of Mugiotia now compared to in the past. The second example I want to show you is, we're only about 30 miles south. We're in the English of the Round Loch of Glen Head. We're in the English Lake District, a river I've worked on a lot. The River Ian, it's important in the UK because of its pearl mussel population. And there's a lot of algae growing there, and we've been investigating the reasons for that. We've been using a benzo torch to measure biomass of algae, sort of portable fluorimeter, and we've got this sort of nice seasonal pattern, actually with the peaks in the winter, which is an interesting story. but also those peaks, there's a lot of diatoms, there's also a lot of green algae in there. And so using the approaches I've described up to now, how we could use that to sort of look a bit more closely at the structures of phytobenthos. And the suggestion is, my suggestion is that that the green algae, they've got their times, they come and go, most abundant into winter, and they're forming the sort of mature phase, to go back to the Biggs et al. Conceptual habitat matrix, and they're creating a habitat within and around which the tabularias and the gomphonemas in particular, and brachycyrus, are able to thrive. And the diatoms, very much in this particular context, are the understory. And at different times, at different places, we get Spirogyra, which is interesting because it's a slimy alga, so it doesn't really encourage epiphytes. But the diatoms still sort of manage to live in and around that Spirogyra matrix. Other times we get Bulboceti, which is a rougher alga, does get quite a few epiphytes, lots of fragillaria growing on it, but again, still getting the tabularias and the gomphonemas. And I'll just, as a nod to Brian Whitten, who mentioned right at the start, Brian would have pointed to these long hairs that the Bulboceti said, and pointed out possesses, and pointed out that those are adaptations that help it to capture organic phosphorus from the water when inorganic phosphorus is scarce. I've put the River Coquet in the far north of England, just near the Scottish border, particularly for Sarah Spalding, just because this is one of our natural Didymasphenia rivers in the UK. We've had Didymasphenia for donkey's years. We don't regard it as an invasive species at all. But just when you look down the microscope at Didymasphenia, you see those stalks are very heavily covered with epiphytes. I should say that by drawing and painting the view down the microscope, you're able to get much more in than if you were sort of having to struggle with stitching or stacking. So that was my sort of rationale for this particular approach. The point is that the Didymasphenia always has these very rich sort of epiphytic assemblages of gomphonema, of acnanthidiums and fragillarias and ulnarias. And actually, when you do a count of a Didymasphenia stream, it's not uncommon just to get 1 or 2% of Didymasphenia itself, because the stalks are about 90% of the biomass, and they sort of create the habitat itself. And to take that a little bit further, I might have to skip a few matter of sake of time, but I'll just finish off with this example from the River Urt, which is again back in the Lake District, because it follows on from that Didymasphenia subject quite nicely. So actually my red spot's on the wrong lake, but probably there's only about 2 people in the webinar that realize that. It should be on the one just below the red spot. But beautiful little river, flows out of Waswater, which is the lake we saw in our earlier pictures. And again, like the River Ian, you get quite high biomass of diatoms and other green algae and cyanobacteria at different times of the year. You can see this is a typical winter view with the quite prolific diatom growths sort of visible with the naked eye, quite a lot of green algae. And if you look, some of those darker spots in there will be cyanobacteria, usually Tolipothrix. And this is quite a common sight, particularly in the rivers downstream of lakes in the winter in the Lake District. I could talk in sort of diatom language and tell you about the gomphonemas and say that there's lots of gomphonema exelissimums, but there's other gomphonemas in there as well. Some of them are quite a struggle to name. And then just to look at the seasonal patterns, I'm lucky enough to visit this lake several times, this river several times over the course of a year, and visiting it for several years as well. So able to get a sense of the seasonal variations. This is a a log scale on the y-axis. So you can see from that, this is just a very simple lowest fit. You can see sort of Gomphonemia is most common, sometimes over 10% in the winter, and least common, sort of rarely more than 2 or 3% in the summer. So it's most common when the water's coldest, but also it's most common when the algal biomass is highest. And again, the Gomphonemia excellissimum, like the Didymusphenia, forms these sort of quite dense sort of matrices with the stalks being heavily colonized by other diatoms, Achnanthidium and Fragillaria especially, to the extent that there's a relationship between the amount of Gomphonemia and the amount of diatom chlorophyll, because the benzo torch lets you separate out the different contributions. There's a significant relationship between the amount of Gomphonemia and the amount of diatom-derived chlorophyll that we don't get when we compare it with the other, when we compare the chlorophyll with the other abundant diatom genera in the sample. So it makes me suggest that the Gomphonemia and the Didymusphenia are sort of acting as sort of foundation species in a way. They're ecosystem engineers building a community for a brief time, because then another ecosystem engineer called a mayfly comes along and gobbles it all up, and we get quite clean stones during the summer. And just a couple of other drawings from the River Urt, because sort of moving away slightly from the sort of theme of diatoms itself, is that the interdependencies of the different algae that you see there. So we often find, I have Mugiotia, for example, doesn't have a particular holdfast of its own, so it sort of piggybacks on the Cyanobacteria. This is what we used to call Formidium autumnale, but we now have to call Microcoleus autumnalis. And the Mugiotia, well, very often when you see any kind of filamentous green, you burrow around with your forceps and you find a cyanobacteria colony in there as well. And the greens seem to use the cyanobacteria. And then, as I showed in the River Urt pictures, sometimes the diatoms are using the green algae as well. This actually, just out of the point of comment, this is my first attempt at online drawing with Adobe Fresco. Most of my other drawings have been watercolor and pencil. And then, as I mentioned, the Pothyrix is often helping to anchor the green algae, but then the Pothyrix itself sort of grows in and around the mosses such as Arachomitrium maciculare. And then finally, this was from the River Urt. This was just a sort of, you don't often see conjugating Mugiotia or Spirogyra, but there it was. So I sort of had a go at capturing that. So I've got some more, but I think I'm just going to skim over, because I've made my main points, I think, and just sort of jump straight to the conclusions, because I'm going to be just a little bit go out on a limb now. If I haven't been out on a limb for the past 40 minutes, you decide. If we look at protein structure, we think of it in terms of primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary, each playing its role in creating a sort of a functional protein in the end, and sort of applying that sort of reasoning to the way we work as diatomists and phycologists, that we've got our primary structure, which is the basic list of taxa, their absolute relative abundance. And that's the feedstock for our multivariate statistics if we're researchers, or our metrics if we're applied scientists perhaps. And we don't often go very much beyond that. So there's a secondary structure. We could think about functional groups and traits. And yes, that's in the primary literature, that there's a lot of people interested in how functional groups help us to explain and understand communities. So they're sort of taking that primary list of taxa and organizing them in a different way in order that we can see if there's a lot of motile taxa or a lot of high profile taxa, for example. So there's a lot of use of the primary structure of our data, some use of the secondary structure of our data. But then we've got the tertiary structure, the interdependencies that create the three-dimensional matrix that I suspect that we're not very good at, except in the most descriptive sense. And then the quaternary, the spatial and temporal patchiness. There was that film a couple of years ago, Everything Everywhere All at Once, and that sometimes when you're sort of looking around a stream and seeing a patch of this and a patch of that and patch of something else, you do feel like every riverbed is its own multiverse, perhaps. But my closing thoughts, or one of my closing thoughts, is that if we're going to do this, we really do need to think beyond diatoms. So apologies for slight heresy in the Diatom Web Academy, but if we're thinking, I would say from secondary structure onwards, we need to be embracing the entire periphyton community, not just the diatoms. And then finally again, sort of this idea, perhaps for the applied scientists here, that ecological metrics, we could think of them as a way of desiccated knowledge. We've got these highly complex communities, and we need to find ways of sort of collapsing them into a portable blob that we can then use for various purposes. So we find ways of collapsing complexity into sort of a numerical form that we can sort of transport around with us. And then we pass those metrics to the managers and the stakeholders who might not have the same specialist knowledge as us. They can be taken at face value, or we could think about how we reconstitute that desiccated knowledge to give either a literal or a metaphorical guiding image of the ecosystem component that they represent. So I'll just finish with a statement from Nigel's essay, From Metrics to Monet. We often operate at levels of detail, a percent change in abundance of species X or Y, for example, that are simply far too esoteric for the average manager or funding agency, let alone the man in the street, to grasp the significance of, if indeed there is any. This is a direct consequence of over-reliance on species-based information. Our basic currency needs to be far more generic, transferable, and indeed utilitarian if we are to argue more effectively for the resources to manage or restore degraded aquatic habitats. So I'll leave you with Nigel's words and say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Martyn. I enjoyed that. I particularly liked the round pictures of the microscope because they were totally linked to the presentation we had last week. Actually,
Oh, right.
They were talking about Ehrenberg doing that as an artistic method.
That mention, just before you go on, that mention of Round reminds me that Frank Round actually was quite a fan of. So before I started this, he was quite a fan of using sort of simple little illustrations like this to sort of communicate ideas. So Frank Round probably deserves a name check as well.
Nice. Thanks. If folks have questions, we've got some time before the top of the hour. You can go ahead and use the raise your hand thing, and we'll call on you, and you can unmute yourself and uncamera yourself and ask your questions. That raise the hand tool is down in the react button at the bottom of your screen. As we wait for a couple, or I should also say, you're also welcome to type your question in the chat, and we can pass that on to Martyn as well. I've got a couple, just as starting points here. I got a couple of questions for you, Martyn. One I'm going to ask you an easy one. How long does it take to make one of those pictures or paintings?
If I was just to sit down and start with a blank sheet of paper and do nothing else, it would probably be couple of days. But I would say there's a big thinking phase and there's a couple of false starts thrown in as well.
Sure, sure.
So it's more likely to be a couple of weeks and just working in. I've got to remember that I have a day job and I don't get paid really for the paintings. But
Uh,
yeah, I'd say there's a thinking phase. Um, I yes, and I yeah, so there's a thinking phase, just a sort of, and I think I just look at I look at my notebooks and say, well, I wonder how they're arranged. I wonder if X sits on Y or so.
well,
Yeah.
well, I was impressed with your paintings because they really do capture something that you can't do with a photograph. They really do, and I think that's super neat. So,
Well, thank you. Yes, and I don't know if you know Chris Carter, the English. He's a sort of enthusiast. He takes really good photographs, and he looks enviously at my paintings, and I look enviously at his photographs. And there's stuff I can do that he can't, and there's stuff that he can do that I can't as well. So, um,
hmm, thanks, Julianne. You got a question? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, Martin, so we've been seeing here in the States at least moving away from soft algae in bioassessment, especially for benthic communities. And that's primarily because the taxonomy is so difficult. We're looking, people are doing species level analyses and nobody can corroborate it. They're not passing QC and it's just too difficult. I would love to see us doing it at a functional level, if not at the genus level, at least at a functional level to consider um, exactly what you're talking about, these interactions and the community as a whole. What do you have any thoughts on that? And is Europe considering soft algae in their bioassessment?
well, um, it's mostly diatom focused in Europe. There's Germany has a method for using soft algae, um, and they've got a sort of nice little community of soft algae specialists who work together. Norway, they don't use diatoms at all. They use the soft algae. Um, I think the Czech Republic, but it's mostly diatoms. And I think I've worked with regulatory bodies long enough to know that they're looking for the shortest and cheapest route to fulfill their legal obligations. And it's nice for me um, as a consultant to spend a few evenings painting and drawing. But yeah, there's a hard world out there um, in terms of sort of just trying to generate the numbers they need to make the decisions. And so I think diatoms are just seen as as a sort of the shortest route from a sample to um, an answer.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a real crisis actually with the death of Brian Whitten last year. I thought that was over 50% of our like field cyanobacterial knowledge gone,
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
think.
we're having the same issues.
Yeah. So I think there's a real crisis. I mean, the diatom community is great. Um, and as you say, there's stuff that we can do, quality control and so on and so forth. But there's just so much knowledge that is just becoming stuff in books rather than stuff that can be shared by one person passing on their experience to another.
Mm.
Worries me.
Thank you. Well, real quick before we move on to Sarah, I just wanted, Martin, I'm going to post the PDF of your article in the webinar emailing list if I have your permission to do
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Cool. All right, thanks, Julianne. Sarah.
Thanks. Thank you, Martin. It's great to see you. And thank you so much for your talk today. And I was I was going to follow. My question was kind of related to Julianne's, but then I also got sort of sidelined by your bringing up the crisis that we're in. But I know, yeah, so go back to the first one, which, for many years, you've been a advocate of getting away from this single number assessment. And how has that worked out? Because on the other hand, I'm a follower of microscopes and monsters, and I know too that you've been one of the things I love is how you enlist your field people to have this sort of inclusive view of a watershed, that they're not necessarily specialists, but they have a very ecological training from you. I don't know, sort of a rambling question there.
Sorry, could you say the question again? Or
Well, I guess the question is how is it going to get people
oh,
away from single
I,
numbers
yeah,
because it's so poor in getting action from
yeah.
managers?
I don't think it's going very well, to be honest. I I see a couple of my friends from the work we do in the European Commission over a number of years here, where we're trying to sort of up the game in various aspects of Water Framework Directive implementation. And once something is adopted for formal regulatory purposes and has a quasi-legal status, it's the devil's own job to get it changed. You you've got to it's not, I mean, as a scientist you think, well, look, I've got a better index here, R squared's better, it's obvious, isn't it? You're going to move, you're going to change. And then no, this is, you've got utility companies that have based their investment plans on our results. And with the uncertainty we've got sites that are sort of moving from one side of the regulatory boundary to the other, and the authorities are a little bit sort of concerned about. Well, they don't like change anyway, and they've probably got a limited number of staff involved in this kind of thing, and they've probably got other priorities than unpicking a system that to them looks like it's working reasonably well. So I mean, the backdrop to all of this was, as I started my drawings round about the back end of the 2000s, so round about the time the world, the global economic crisis. And so ever since then, we've been on the back foot trying to sort of just keep going as budgets have been slashed all around us. Europe, on the single metric point, Europe has this tendency for using single metrics for diatoms, and the multi-metrics have never taken off in the same way. And I think there's just a conservatism going on. But again, once it's in the system, as it were, it's quite difficult to change, I think.
How about in the UK? Do you have a more inclusive approach in the UK outside of the European Union?
Well, no, not really, because all of those European laws are still on our statute books. So although in theory, we were going to ditch Europe's rules and forge our own path, in practice, it's the same problem. You've got to unpick the law, rewrite not necessarily the primary legislation, but certainly rewrite the regulations that go with it, and you've got to consult with stakeholders and get their views. The big change we have had in the UK is the adoption of metabar coding for diatoms, that has happened, but that's really in just replacing. It's almost a like for like replacement, just a different enumeration method. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, I don't think we've had a sort of a step change in the quality of ecological assessment as a result.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing today.
Yeah. And thank you very much, Martyn, for sharing your insights and your art with us today.
It's
That
been
was
my pleasure.
just really, it's so neat to see diatoms and algal communities portrayed in such a easy to grasp way, and I can really understand your passion for this. That brings us to the top of the hour, folks. Want to thank everyone for joining us at the Diatom Web Academy. Join us in 2 weeks when Itzi Jovanovska is going to talk to us about African diatoms. Come back then, and we'll join together again in community to celebrate some of our favorite things, the diatoms.